And welcome to Open Democracy's live weekly discussions. I'm Mary Fitzgerald. I'm the editor-in-chief of Open Democracy. We have a fantastic panel for you today. Open Democracy does awesome investigative journalism that challenges power and inspires change. This week, we are going to be talking to a fantastic panel of experts on some of the choices and challenges that the US election has put front and center. Bit of housekeeping first. Thank you to everyone who's joining us. We want this conversation to involve you as much as possible. You can participate in the chat, either on Facebook or on Zoom, and we'll try and get to as many of your questions as we can. Thank you to everyone who submitted really excellent questions ahead of time, and we'll try and thread those through. Please, in advance, forgive any technical hitches, interruptions from pets or small children. This is the context we operate in now, so please bear with us. I'm going to introduce each panelist as I ask them questions in turn, and I'm going to start with Mark Potok, who for 20 years was a leader, has been 20 years a leader and a top analyst of the Southern Poverty Law Center and the anti-racist organization, and he's now a senior fellow at the Center for Analysis of the Radical Right, which are our partners in this fantastic event. Mark, we were just talking there about the United States really being at a crossroads. This feels very personal to me as well. I was born in Atlanta, Georgia, even though I don't sound like I was. And could you just put us in the picture of really what this crossroads is, what we're facing now? And the term fascism is used often and bandied around, and it's a very significant and loaded term. I wonder if it makes any sense or is applicable at all in this context. So yeah, put us in the picture.
Well, I think it is true that we are historically at a real crossroads in this country, one in which we could go one of a couple of different directions. You know, I'm not sure that fascism per se, in the sense that we think of it as what we saw in the 1930s and so on, is exactly appropriate. But it is, I think, absolutely clear that we have a president and an administration that is increasingly authoritarian in almost every way you can think of, who takes institutions like the military and attempts to use them in anti-democratic ways, which tries to weaponize the police and other institutions against internal enemies. We, of course, started with Trump's campaign, attacking Mexicans, all on Mexican immigrants as rapists and drug dealers and so on. So there was this attack on the external enemy as well. So, you know, I think that we are at a moment when democratic institutions in this country are rather shaky and under a lot of threat. You know, we are not Weimar Germany. I'm not trying to argue that. I think that institutions in American society are clearly more resilient than that, but they are under siege. You know, not to go on for long about this, but I think that in some sense, this is a moment similar to the 1920s in particular in the United States, when enormous socioeconomic changes were going. The country was urbanizing, women were getting the right to vote. Traditional religion was under attack. A number of huge transformational changes were going on. You know, what it produced in the United States in the 20s was the largest Klan in our history, Klan of some 4 million people, which among other things was instrumental in passing our racist immigration quota system, which lasted until 1965. So, you know, I feel that this is an incredibly important election, and that in one sense, you can see it as a choice between heading more down the autocratic road or pulling ourselves back, as we did in the United States during the Depression and then entering World War II, and head in a more democratic direction.
Thank you, Mark, for laying that out so clearly. Evian, you are an American living abroad who has seen all this from some distance, but obviously feels close to it. And you have made the links between what's happening in the States and what's happening in some other countries that are turning increasingly authoritarian. And I'd love to hear your perspective on that.
Yeah, so in terms of my personal perspective, I think I can sum it up in one word, which is that it's just been surreal to watch this all from a distance. And I'm sure, Mary, you agree with me on that. And I mean, in a way, my media consumption has remained exactly the same. I'm probably reading the same media outlets that many of us here are reading. So my interpretation of what's going on is really shaped by that, but also by, of course, communicating with friends and family back home and sort of hearing the impacts of what it's been like for them. Now, most of my family and friends live in California, so in many ways, they do feel like they're also kind of isolated from what's happening. In some ways, of course, not all. But yeah, I think in terms of maybe looking at this from a global perspective, because that's what I do in my work. I mean, I had moved to Oslo, to Norway, to start my PhD at the Center for Research on Extremism. And I moved here in October 2016. And then Trump was elected the very next month, right? So it really shaped, I think, like our global understanding of what was happening around the world. But I think just to take a step back, what we saw with Trump's election was this domino effect that had happened, right? We saw in Europe far-right politicians and parties being elected into power, and then with Bolsonaro in Brazil as well. But when we look at the far-right at a global perspective, I mean, if we look at Asia, there's been far-right leaders there years before Trump was elected into power, right? And Trump has built very close relationships, not least, people like Prime Minister Modi in India, or even Viktor Orban in Hungary, who was elected before Trump, right? So we see these forces at play. And I think it's important to see that, of course, what happens in the US is going to have global effects, but that's not to say what's going to happen globally isn't going to affect the US either.
Thank you, Evin. I forgot to introduce you fully. You are head of publishing with our partners, the Center for Analysis of the Radical Right, and you are a postdoc affiliate at the Center for Research on Extremism at the University of Oslo, which you elegantly worked into your response. I'm coming now to Brian Hughes, who is Associate Director for the Polarization and Extremism Research and Innovation Lab, which has got a wonderful acronym, PERIL, at American University, Washington, DC. Now, so we've been talking a little bit about the global perspective and the links or parallels between different far-right and authoritarian leaders and movements across the world. But let's zoom into the United States. Let's get domestic, because there are some extraordinary and quite specific things happening within far-right networks and groups and movements, many of them online. You talked about accelerationism, which I'd love to hear a bit more about, but tell us some of the, I guess, powerful and really quite out there conspiracy theories and narratives circulating around certain networks and what you understand by them.
Sure. Well, in order to discuss extremist groups on the far right in relation to the present election, you really have to begin with the militia movement. The militia movement is a collection of far-right paramilitary organizations and tendencies that have been a long-running and a long-standing problem in the United States. And the extent to which they are a problem ebbs and flows over time, usually in direct relation to government intervention, government attempts to suppress them. And at the moment, our militia groups are flowing very, very strongly. Just recently, the FBI arrested a group of militia members in Michigan who were planning to kidnap the governor of that state. As I said, it ebbs or flows depending on the decisions that government makes in terms of how they're going to respond to the militia movement. The Trump administration has extended what you might call a kind of tacit license or turned a blind eye or been in denial, if you want to be charitable about it. They've been in denial about the threat of the militia movement. So the militia movement, I think rightly, sees the possibility of a Biden presidency as a threat to its ability to operate. And because this is kind of a fever swamp of conspiracy theories, that gets spun out into threats about global governance, the American government taking away firearms, the American government setting up internment camps for militia members, and so on and so forth. So I think that if you see a Biden presidency in January, you'll see a surge in militia activity as a response to those perceived threats. Perceived threats are really one of the fundamental characteristics of all extremist groups. Now, in the event of a Trump re-election, I think you'll also see a surge in militia activity. But I think that that surge will come about for different reasons, sort of as a result of the lackluster intervention that law enforcement has been allowed to pursue in relation to the militia movement in the United States. Now, I don't want to go on too long, but there is sort of an underlying ethic that is driving the militia movements and indeed a lot of the other extremist groups in the United States, and that's this sentiment or strategy or ideology of accelerationism. And what that means, a very thumbnail sketch definition, is this idea that our current system is untenable, it's destined for collapse. And these accelerationist extremist groups want to hasten that collapse in the hopes that they can rebuild society in their preferred image after the collapse. So I think we're going to be seeing, again, regardless of whether we see a Trump or a Biden presidency, an ongoing dynamic of acceleration with a variety of groups hoping to heighten the contradictions or to heighten social conflict, the threat of violence, as some kind of attempt to bring the current order toppling down.
Thank you. I'm going to come back to that in a little while, but I wanted to pick up Bethan here because Bethan, you're a doctoral candidate at the Department of History at the University of Cambridge and a fellow at the Centre for Analysis of the Radical Right, our partners. And your specialism is really looking at white supremacism online, and particularly the recruitment that happens online, and particularly amongst younger people. So could you bring us into the picture on that?
Yeah, I think actually what Brian is talking about, a lot of the links between militia movements, conspiracy theories, and accelerationism really ties into my work as well. So we see that, and one of the great or interesting bridges that's happening now is vigilantism. So recently in Kenosha, there was an individual who was, I believe, age 17, who's been arrested and charged with the murder of 2 individuals. So a teenager who's participating in some degree of radical right violence, allegedly. And that's actually not uncommon, not only in the United States, but throughout the world. There's a rise in teenagers, minors, or also people who are over the age of 18, who are engaging in radical right violence. In many cases, it's also white supremacist violence. They're often being radicalized, again, through conspiracy theories that they're seeing online, on social media, and also accelerationist narratives. So actually what you're seeing in theory is a lot of accelerationist groups will say, we don't recruit children, we don't recruit minors, everyone has to be at least over the age of 16, and we don't encourage violence. That's very much a sort of at face value judgment. It's, for one thing, very difficult to tell if someone is underage online. They can fake their age, and that's very often what's happening. So you're seeing young people who are now getting access to really radical material online, going forward and perpetrating attacks or being interrupted prior to making attempts, which is becoming a real problem. But because of the sort of readily available nature of information online, the number of people who are engaging with conspiracy theories, accelerationism, white supremacism is increasing. And that also is leading to more violence, or at least threats of violence, from young people in the United States, but also overseas as well.
Thank you, Bethan. Yeah, and I guess I want to dig a bit deeper into why is all this happening now? I mean, actually, I wanted to come to you next, because I think one of the things that is often assumed is that, you know, this is all angry white men, right, of a certain profile and background. You researched the use of online platforms to circulate far right, you know, male supremacist and white supremacist ideologies. But bring us in the gender dimension of this. That's my first question. And then I wanted to ask you all a bit more about where this is coming from and how it's happening.
Hi, thank you. So I also study the far right online, predominantly in that circulation, but I look at how gendered logics forward kind of the rest of the different ideologies and blend them and cross between different ideologies in the online space. And a primary kind of problematic around how we understand the far right is that we tend to understand, for a multiplicity of reasons, often related to prosecution in the US, we tend to understand action as violence. And so we don't often look to what we see as more passive roles like support that tend to be the space that women engage in. And those roles are incredibly important. They sustain these movements over time. They pass on the information to the next generation. They do a lot of work, the women involved in these movements. And I think it's especially important after the sort of shock the US experienced when the statistic that 53% of white women who voted for Trump in 2016 happened, and people just couldn't seem to kind of incorporate that information to understand that there are many women engaged with ideologies from the radical right through the far right, and deeply so. And that is an agentic choice, right? It's older theories of someone's involved because of their boyfriend or husband miss the point that women also choose to be part of these networks, and that has an impact on how we understand how they work and who is involved and what action looks like. And we could certainly talk more about criminality, but because of the way prosecutions work, particularly in the US, not having a federal statute that we use to prosecute the crimes, right? Active criminal activity is what we see the most and talk about the most. I think it's also really important to realize that gendered logics are an intrinsic part of these ideologies. Gendered power is an intrinsic part of these ideologies, right? So women are supposed to be in a supportive role. That is their action in the group. Women are supposed to bear the next generation of white children and do so very joyfully. And so there's a lot of linkages to things like what are going on in the Supreme Court nomination process right now, what is going on with movements against Roe versus Wade and other laws and policies related to the status of women that these groups are intrinsically interested in relation to their ideologies around things like white genocide, that can engage women very specifically. And narratives of women's safety and sexual violence are also factors that bring women into the groups. And as Bethan mentioned, right, the Kenosha activity, the Kenosha shootings, the mother of the shooter was involved in bringing him to the location and ensuring that he was a participant. So I think it becomes important to kind of understand those roles.
Thank you. And Evian, you had some points to add to this as well about the gender dimension to all this.
Yeah, absolutely. And I completely agree with what Ashley has just very eloquently said. I just wanted to chip in on this point since I have a forthcoming book on women in the alt-right and trad wives specifically. So this is a community called, it's short for traditional wife, but it's essentially women who sort of hark back for this sort of 1950s nostalgia, suburban lifestyle where men are the breadwinners of the family and, you know, women take care of domestic duties. And so I've been looking a lot in the past couple of years about at women influencers on social media. And I think there's a very insidious role that they can play in these spaces in terms of what they can offer to young men. Because while you might think that many of these women in the alt-right or the far right try to recruit women actively, they often end up recruiting men more often. Based upon, you know, like who they discuss, who their followers are and who their fans are. And for those who are sort of unfamiliar, this year there was the trial for a man named Philip Mattheis, who went to have an attempted attack at a mosque outside of Oslo. And it was later revealed in the court hearings this year that, you know, he was vehemently following these women in the US, these alt-right women, and sort of became obsessed with this idea of finding a wife and having white children and moving to the countryside, right? So there's a very insidious role that these women can play transnationally as well in how they sort of inspire young men across the world.
Thank you. Yeah, I remember my colleague Claire Provo in one of her pieces during the most intense part of the COVID lockdowns globally, she quoted somebody saying, I can't remember who, I'll have to look it up, but we're all trad wives now, right? So now we're all discovering the joys of being at home and being domestic and doing nothing but that. A woman's place is in the home, which I thought was a very telling comment. And I want to get on to how COVID and how the current situation is playing in. But I actually wanted to sort of zoom back a bit first and go, what is driving all this? You know, why has this, I mean, Brian, you made the point that there's a long history of militias in the United States, and we could go back very far. And Mark, you've been studying this, you know, these issues for a very long time. Anyone who wants to sort of put their hand up and say, these are the things that outsiders need to understand about why this has been a long-term feature of American life. And I would be fascinated to just hear that explanation for a kind of global audience.
I mean, despite, much has been said about the role of women, the role of the internet and so on, and those things are important. Social media is important, but I think that there is a very strong tendency, not among our group, but especially in the politically right-wing media here, to ascribe this movement to things like algorithms on Facebook. The kids are watching too many violent videos. They smoked too much pot when they were young. They don't have a girlfriend. They're mentally ill. And, that's a very easy answer. And, from a law enforcement perspective, maybe, and definitely from a Republican kind of right-wing perspective here, that's an easy explanation, right? Or they're not really right-wingers at all. They're really left-wingers in disguise. The Trump administration tried to describe the Christchurch, New Zealand mass murderer as an eco-terrorist. Ridiculous. So to get to the meat of the question, I would suggest that this country and Western Europe and a lot of the rest of the world, extending to places like India, these are places that are changing and changing extremely dramatically. In a sense, these are all kind of ramifications of globalization. Globalization in the sense that in the United States, our demographics, thanks to immigration and varying fertility rates among different groups, white people are about to lose their majority in this country. We have been 90% white for almost our entire post-colonial history. That only began to change in 1965 with the change in immigration laws. So, the idea that in 25 years, whites will lose their majority here is incredibly important. Study after study after study has shown that Trump was not basically elected because of economic inequalities or economic distress in this country. Trump was elected largely because of white concerns about other races, about ethnic threats from other groups, and matters of cultural, meaning essentially racial, identity. There are other ways the world is changing than demographics. Another aspect of globalization, of course, is financial, is economic. There are huge sectors of people in this country who you don't read about much in the national or international news, who are hurting. Auto workers, textile workers, steel workers. There's an American analog to the Brexit vote, right? I mean, the people who voted for Brexit are essentially the same kind of people who voted for Trump in many ways in this country. And then there are these huge cultural changes, the most obvious example perhaps being the idea that same-sex marriage is now legal in 50 states. That was essentially unimaginable 15 years ago, just as it was unimaginable 20 years ago that we would have a Black president. So these are enormous changes. I'm not in any way trying to justify the radical right. Their response is pathological. But let me add just a couple of other points I think that are important that we haven't really gotten to. One is the idea that these groups, the conspiracy theories that Brian talked about have been with us forever. And, the militia movement, by and large, has had one single conspiracy theory, kind of unifying field theory of all that's wrong with the world, which is, evil forces are involved and bringing us into a new world order, a global government. The UN will soon be at our doors to take our guns, et cetera, et cetera. There are camps being set up by the government to intern good patriots and so on. And there are 1,000 variations on that and other conspiracy theories, but really they come down to the idea of our country is being stolen from us. And the harshest conspiracy theories emanate from the neo-Nazi right, not so much the militia movement, but the idea that, the great replacement, whites are being replaced in their own country, the country which our forefathers built for us. It's being taken from us. If I may make just one other, so there's an enormous amount of talk, not only on the radical right, but on the Christian right, on the political right, about a civil war around the corner, about a race war. Everybody imagines it a little differently. but the idea is that there will be bloodshed in the streets. And of course, Donald Trump is contributing to this mightily with the idea that the election we're about to have is illegitimate. It's already been tarred as illegitimate by much of the Republican Party. Democrats are secretly plotting against us. There are an enormous amount of theories right this moment about how Democrats are planning to steal the election, and so on. And if I may, just another very brief point about women. I agree with all that was said about women in the movement, but I think something that was maybe less emphasized that ought to be said is the radical right, and in particular, the iteration of it, what we call the alt-right, is fundamentally misogynistic. They hate women. So yes, there are some women leaders, but believe me, this is not a woman-dominated movement at all. It is fundamentally about men. The women play support roles in the sense that they're beefing up this idea of, what a man is supposed to be. And this coincides again with the Christian right world, the idea of headship, the real relationship of men to their family is they're the boss, and so on. And, it's also, I think, worth pointing out when I say openly misogynistic, I mean, the Proud Boys, these groups that President Trump thinks are, A-OK, and, maybe should back them up come election day. These are groups that explicitly attack women, say, women are dumb, they're all temptresses and gold diggers, and they shouldn't be, Richard Spencer, the guy who coined the term alternative right, doesn't think that women should be allowed to vote. And let me just say as a parenthetic, anecdotal add to that, Spencer, who is going to lead the alt-right to victory and save the American white masses and all that's good and right about America, is in the middle of a divorce trial in which his wife or ex-wife now has produced quite a lot of documentary evidence showing that he beat her up regularly, he dragged her down the stairs by the hair, he told her she should commit suicide, et cetera, et cetera. And that kind of attitude towards women is incredibly common on the radical right. We've had a couple of groups from time to time, Women for Aryan Unity, which are the kind of, feminists, very light of the radical right. But, this is not a movement that is, somehow, bringing women to leadership positions or that is in some weird sense feminist at all.
Thank you very much. I was speaking to someone just the other day based in Seattle who has voted for Obama twice, was going to vote for Bernie and ended up voting for Trump instead. And one of the things that was quite clear in his characterization of the world was that, he wanted a 1950s situation for men and women. And he hadn't had a girlfriend for a very long time. And so it's that love-hate, have, not have dynamic, which I think is very powerful for some particularly younger men. And the points you made speak to that too. Bethan wanted to come in here on this point as well, the sort of what's going on, why, what's behind all of this.
I mean, I think that Mark is fundamentally correct in the assessment that, right, these conspiracy theories aren't new. Great Replacement, you can have sort of Jewish conspiracy theory. They're not new things. They're being reiterated, refashioned in many ways, and lots of changes that are happening in the world, globalization, mass migration, economic inequality. Those things aren't new, but they're very much speak to a lot of the fundamental points that these groups are trying to address. They promise this kind of nostalgic return to an idealistic past that many people who actually lived in the 1950s might not have actually described as being all that idealistic, or the 60s, etc. But I also think we need to recognize that the radical right, particularly accelerationists, are doing work, new work, to recruit people as well. So I look at accelerationism, particularly, there's an author named James Mason who wrote a series of works called Siege in the 1980s that was then published as a book that was republished many times. And in fact, it is a growing and changing document that's been picked up by Atomwaffen Division, which is a very well-known white supremacist or neo-Nazi terrorist group and who perpetrates violence, or whose members have been accused of perpetrating a great deal of violence. And right, that linkage is a new one. It's only happened in the last several years. And the document Siege itself is being republished and is growing. So there are actually hundreds of new pages of information, and there's a whole Siege culture website that's growing to respond to what is perceived to be changes in the political environment. So it's not simply that the radical right, particularly neo-Nazis or neo-fascists, are only relying on old narratives and old tropes, or looking at nostalgia. There really are attempts to grow and be responsive to what's going on. And that's how they are picking up new people, is they're setting up these huge culture websites, they're publishing new books, they're writing new things, they're feigning intellectualism in a very particular way, certain groups at least, that is appealing to new audiences. And in many cases doesn't always present initially as being as radical as it is. So in fact, people are engaging in a radicalization process that starts out maybe with something that's about global capitalism or globalization, that's speaking to people who are disenfranchised, that slowly sucks them further into a world that is radicalizing them. So I think it's important to acknowledge that some people are being radicalized without their knowledge, and also that there is a movement within the radical right to adopt and adapt to new environments as well. So that's part of why we're seeing change, is because they're also responsive to changes that are happening in society. So it's new to us because it's also new to them on a certain level.
Thank you. I wanted to pick up the question there about left-wing extremism as well, and that left-wing, because I know that there's this sort of often a false equivalence or false accusations made about people's political identities. But Brian, you mentioned this before as well. Like, is left-wing extremism a danger, a problem, a threat? You know, what does the logic of extremism look like on both poles? And yeah, looking particularly ahead to what happens next in the election.
Right. Well, before we begin any discussion of left-wing extremism, you have to emphasize that the vast majority of political violence in the United States belongs to the far right and the extreme right. I believe it's something like more than 80%. Now, that's not to say that the left wing is incapable of violence. Certainly it is capable of violence. And there have been periods of American history where far left groups have committed political violence on a very regular basis. Now, this summer, we've seen a very intense street protest movement in the United States that involved members of some of these militia groups, the Boogaloo groups that are kind of an odd, weird tendency of militia style thinking, along with radical left organizations, or I shouldn't say organizations, but radical left radical left tendencies. And I mean, the difficulty that I have even describing that kind of points to a very troubling set of circumstances here in the United States, and maybe abroad. Maybe Evian can speak to that. But people who are trying to understand what's happening in places like Minneapolis and Portland, just through media reports, are kind of subject to a fog of war situation where it can be very difficult to understand what's happening. And I think we're actually at a moment of a new left-wing political dispensation coalescing in this country, and the results of the 2020 election are going to have a really, I think, powerful influence on that. What we saw with the election of Barack Obama was that the American left, which had really been animated as an anti-war movement, the wind came out of its sails. It fractured. The American left has always been very fractious, and it has very weak institutions. So it tends to be kind of ideologically inchoate. And as a consequence, you saw some people who had been a part of that anti-war left splinter off into a more hard-nosed Marxian critique of political economy. But then you saw some who sort of maintained that inchoate, poorly formed ideology, who drifted into some of these more conspiracy spaces that are now being wrapped up into these movements and these scenes that really complicate and in some ways are incoherent on that left-right axis. Things like QAnon, even though there's a very strong far-right contingent, aren't purely definable as belonging to the far right. Even a lot of accelerationist movements, certainly not Adam Waffen or the Base or groups like that, are quite clearly on the far right. But a lot of accelerationist, minor accelerationist tendencies really complicate our attempts to categorize them as belonging exclusively to the left or exclusively to the right. So I think that what we might be seeing, if I'm going to prognosticate and make predictions about the election, is that we are likely to see more complex ideological justifications for violence. And of course, it's always possible that an ideologically coherent radical left can emerge as an actual force, which may or may not undertake acts of political violence. But for the time being, we have to be clear where the threats and where the violence is coming from, and that is at the moment unambiguously from the far right.
Thank you. One of the audience members who submitted a question beforehand said, you know, the far right gains control by demonizing common words that merely describe alternatives like socialism. And what do we do about that, right? I mean, in Europe, like lots of very mainstream political parties have the word socialist in their names, but it has very different connotations in the United States, and it absolutely is a sort of demonizing word in some circles. So I wanted to know if anyone wanted to respond to that point, because I think it really speaks to where political consensus is, or where the so-called political center is, and how different that is in the US and in Europe. But it's also about naming and language, right? It's not necessarily about reality or about policy or about beliefs. So it'd be great to hear, and this is partly, I'm leading into this because there've been a lot of questions throughout this about what do we do? You know, how can we as citizens and as people face the challenges posed by these extremist movements? So I guess the first question in that thread is naming, socialism being an example, but the control of the narrative and the control of language, I think is and the use of language in these contexts, with these spaces, is quite interesting. So if anyone wanted to just put their hand up and come in on that question, that would be great. Volunteers? Thank you.
I can speak slightly to it if you'd like. I think to the issue of socialism in particular as a term, and then more broadly, I think also as an American living abroad, it's an interesting thing to listen to speeches. It's not just something that's done on the radical right either. You're seeing, I believe a few years ago, Wayne LaPierre, speaking on behalf of the NRA, spoke about European style socialism or European style certain things, which was sort of a very interesting way, as a person living in Europe, at least for a little bit longer anyway, to connote something. But I think socialism in particular has baggage that goes back to the Cold War at the very least, that makes it a very easy target to talk about. But more generally, naming is really critical in political discourse. It helps you identify both who you are and who you aren't, who your enemies are and who your friends are. So I think people are being really careful about the language that they use, and that's true on the radical left, if you want to call it that, the radical right, etc. I think mastery of narrative is really critical. It's very difficult and very slow moving, especially when you have a country as vast with as many belief systems and intermingling, as Brian has said, right? People can hold beliefs that are both popular on the left and the right, etc. People don't live in that binary in the same way. So I think it's going to be quite difficult to come up with like a singular, coherent narrative that would appeal to everyone that can fight the radical right as a whole, because it's not a singular unit either. But I think people need to work very hard to learn how to train themselves to hear what we call dog whistles, terminology that's used to connote something else. And then, at least in their interpersonal life, one of the ways you can help is by calling people out who use those kinds of narratives, saying, I hear you saying this. What do you mean by that? Where have you heard this from? Why do you feel this way? And maybe that would be one way that people at openDemocracy audience members can try to do a little bit of something, even if they can't confront the radical right en masse. But it can do things in at least your personal life to combat what you would see as a problem.
Thank you. I think that Ashley, I'll definitely come to you on this question. And I wanted to thread one more thing through here, which is another question that someone asked, which is to what extent are US far-right groups genuine grassroots organizations, or are they funded, quote, from above by private interests? Now, openDemocracy has done an absolute ton of fantastic investigative journalism on dark money and secretive influence and misinformation and all those very rich subjects. So this is a well put question. How much, and it goes to your point, Bethan, about asking people, where did you see this? Well, you know, what website was that, and who funds it? And oh, you don't, you know, the questions about the agendas behind the people who, or the organizations or the networks that are providing you the information, I think is a great kind of talking point. But so I wanted to thread that point in and ask people about that, but also to come to you, Ashley, to expand on Bethan's point about naming and language.
I mean, I think from a sort of policy standpoint, we have a larger problem, policy and legal standpoint, and it's global, although the US has a particular flavor of this problem, which is definitional, right? Extremism versus terrorism, right? What are the definitions there? What do we mean when we say it? How do groups skirt that? What is the line between the radical right, the far right, the extreme right wing? And people engaging in those groups who also engage politically understand very clearly, at least in the US, how to play with those lines. One of the projects my research team has done recently is to build a data set of all people prosecuted who are related to known right-wing extremist organizations in the US from 2011 to early in 2020. We've got a lot of work to do to update recent events. But we did that to try and categorize those things against the new DHS strategic framework of racially and ethnically motivated violent extremism, REMV, versus targeted violence, which would include things like incel violence, mass shootings at schools, misogynist violence more generally, and then hate crime. And that is because we do not have a charge attached for domestic terrorism for these groups. Around First Amendment issues, there's a lot of really important issues that have to be pulled apart in order to understand that legally, why those definitional frames, policy frames, and then media frames, because media follow certain rules that they decide on related to those policy and legal frameworks to protect themselves as well, that we aren't generally discussing this as terrorism, maybe not even extremism in the media. We saw a shift with the militia plot against Governor Whitmer, where a media organization then went the opposite direction and said, we're going to call this domestic terrorism, not militia. Well, it's both. It is a militia group that are domestic terrorists. But so we're still even playing with that terminology. And while we don't have better working language for that, that allows us to have a certain amount of mushiness between sort of more normative conservative groups, like Mark mentioned, conservative Christian right, the very kind of right-wing conservatives in this country, and these other groups that can align around issues like misogyny and anti-feminism and share propaganda, share media, right? Tradwife culture does this all the time. Very normative, non-extremist tradwives will share propaganda from very extremist right-wing groups around certain ideas about what it is to be a woman in our culture and what that should look like. So there are these interesting like online affinities between languages that many people who are doing propaganda and speaking for groups at the current moment are very good at using, that play off of our inability in the US in any event to have clear delineations about what constitutes extremist propaganda, extremist language, right? In the case of socialism in this country is often conflated, broadly speaking, with communism because of its history of use in the general popular imagination. So people who want to can leverage that set of fears into narratives that fit right-wing conspiracies. I think a really good example of how language can be utilized and morphed is actually QAnon, as Brian brought up. One of the things I study, and I'll have a podcast with Carr coming out on this, is QA moms. So why are momfluencers so heavily involved in QAnon, and why are there so many of the political candidates running related to QAnon women? And there's specific reasons for that. So listen to that podcast if you want to know more. But like, that is a conspiracy theory that weaves together clearly fascist narratives and conspiracies. The protocols of the elders of Zion are woven into conspiracies about Wayfair cabinets used as a metaphor for trafficking children. So it really matters, but language around this is in flux, and people are generally trying to do more work to define this. The election matters because policy and law is affected around this issue specifically based on who the next administration is run by. And we saw that in 2016 with the removal of right-wing extremism from DHS language and in favor of a focus on Islamic terrorism. And funding for grants and things like that now have to be very careful about what groups they say they work on. So it matters.
Thank you, Ashley. Would you enter the podcast info into the chat as well? Because there are a couple of people who want more details on that.
It's actually not published yet, so as soon as it's published, I'm happy to email it to folks at openDemocracy so you can share it.
Okay, and you can maybe put a link to the website so that people can site and see, because that sounds really interesting. And you brought us very nicely into why this election matters. I mean, this election matters for so many people across the world, right? It matters for future generations, potentially the quality of the air they breathe, because it matters whether or not the US is going to rejoin the Paris Agreement. It matters for millions and millions of women across the world who need to access basic family planning services that are currently not provided under US government restrictions. It matters for more reasons than we could possibly list here. But I think one of the things that I wanted to ask all of you, given your study and focus, is what's going to happen on November the 3rd? Or what could happen on November the 3rd and afterwards? How do you see this playing out in the coming weeks and months? And again, just hands up for anyone who wants to take that chestnut on. I see you smiling, Brian, and I see Mark your hand too. So I'm.
Well, you know, if I could tell you how the election was going to turn out, you know, I might be on the phone with Las Vegas right now. But I think that I think that you brought up a very important point, which is the consequences of this election on environmental policy in the United States and the impact that will have on climate change and the already the environmental catastrophe that's already upon us. It's my belief, and you know, we've been doing research on this, that the sense of impending doom that accompanies climate change is a primary driver of accelerationist violence and ideology, and just the sort of accelerationist attitude that's really beginning to influence not only extremist groups, but mainstream society as well. This feeling that we're on a runaway train, and the people who are in charge of steering it have an almost predatory interest in not doing so, in not averting environmental catastrophe. So I think that if we are to see, whichever the next administration is, if we are to see them actually take seriously the threats that are associated with climate change, which is already here, I hope that would reduce the pressure that's driving some of these extremist groups, that will reduce some of the sort of hard material conditions that drive people into this effective state of agitation that can make extremist ideologies attractive and political violence seem like a solution.
Thank you. And that's again to your point of left and right? Because it touches both ends of that spectrum. And Mark, I want to come to you. And another really great question that someone asked before this discussion was, isn't Trump just as dangerous not in office, right? So what happens after the election? Let's assume that Trump is defeated. Let's address that question as well in our thoughts about this, the consequences for terrorist / extremist / militia movements and networks, both in the States and internationally.
Well, no, I don't think Trump is anywhere near as dangerous out of office in office. I think that's, you know, a pretty basic misunderstanding of what's going on. You know, Trump is really the driver of, I mean, he's a reflection of a lot of what we're seeing, but he's very much the driver of a lot of it as well. You know, let me just return, to, if I might, to another topic briefly, which is, you know, we talked about November 3rd, but Brian really talked about the biggest picture possible, thinking about what kind of happens after that. You know, on November 3rd, we know there are going to be armed members of the radical right, people from groups like the Three Percenters, like the Oath Keepers, like the League of the South, people from QAnon discussion groups. These people are going to be at least some polling places, at least in the upper Midwest, with weapons. They have been encouraged by our president explicitly to do that. And, you know, let's also remember that when Trump was asked about the Proud Boys, which is fundamentally white nationalist group, certainly a group of the radical right, he was like, well, stand back and stand by. To me, it seems perfectly plain what the man was saying. Stand by, boys. We may need you at election time. So, you know, I'm not predicting widespread violence, but we know for a fact that there are going to be people out there engaged in armed intimidation of voters. So, you know, I'm just saying that, you know, it seems obvious that in the next few weeks, we are going to see violence around this election. You know, the cities aren't going to burn. We're not going to be in a civil war or a race war, but it may be a very scary moment. And, you know, what happens in the days afterward, if it's not a Democratic landslide, if it is a very close race or Trump even, you know, either wins or comes close to winning, it can only get worse. So, you know, I think it's a scary few weeks we're looking at coming up.
Thank you. I wanted to come back to the is Trump just as dangerous not in office question though, because I mean, obviously the literal answer to that is no. But what happens to this when there is no longer a president?
A supreme leader, you know, of the radical right. I mean, you know, I think that there's something to that, right? And, you know, in fact, in general, I think that when you look at the last 25, 30 years of the American radical right, you find that it's in periods when there were strong groups with leaders who were well known on the radical right, that as a general matter, the violence, the terrorist violence from the radical right diminished. So that you had leaders like William Pierce of the infamous neo-Nazi National Alliance in this country, no longer alive, but, you know, who's always talking about, you know, we've got to send all the Jews to their graves and the race mixers and so on. But, you know, in effect was saying, yes, yes, boys, we'll kill the Jews, but that'll be next week. For now, let's organize. You know, what we saw in the 2000s was a diminution of these groups. Many of the strongly led groups fell apart. Their leaders died or went to prison. And so you're seeing a much, much more amorphous movement of people out there who, if not exactly lone wolf terrorists or leaderless resistance cells, are something like that. And so I think that you're much more likely oftentimes to see political violence when the radical right is not so well organized, when it's more like what we saw in Charlottesville in 2017, which is a bubbling up of new individuals. You know, what we saw in Charlottesville was a whole new generation. I mean, for people like us at the Southern Poverty Law Center at the time, you know, you were quite familiar with lots and lots of the leaders and even the footmen in the radical right. And Charlottesville was really interesting because there was a whole lot, thousands of people who had never been seen before, who hadn't made appearances on the internet. So I think that's a very real danger. And I think clearly that's the kind of political violence we're looking at. You know, these acts are not planned by groups anymore like they were in the 60s during the civil rights movement. They almost invariably come from a single individual or that guy, you know, his girlfriend and his best friend and his dog or whatever it may be.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And Evian, you wanted to come in on this question as well.
Yeah, thanks, Mary. I think this is such an important question, but it also sort of hints to, I think, what's an important element that's been missing in this conversation that we've been having, which is that, I mean, too often, I think as scholars or commentators of the far right, we tend to study this phenomenon as something that's quite fringe or something that's quite at the extreme, something that exists on the peripheries. And, you know, certainly with Trumpism, we see this as some type of abnormality sometimes. I mean, I can't tell you how often I'm listening to podcasts and they always say, when are we going to get back to normal? When is everything going to, you know, be great again? And, you know, not actually great again. Sorry, don't take that out of context. But I think, you know, what we're missing in this conversation too often is the fact that we fail to recognize how Trump has really, in essence, been distinctly weaponizing and mobilizing on what has been pre-existing white supremacist structures within the US. I mean, we cannot let go of the fact that this is a country that was founded on genocide and slavery. And this has a very long legacy that, of course, is you know, sort of vocalized most vehemently within the extreme right, I mean, and within militia groups and so forth. But I think, you know, in order to address like, how can we fix the solution and how can we redress what's been happening the last 4 years, we really need to go back to the root, I think, of, you know, how institutions in the US have been fundamentally structured along racial lines.
Thank you very much, Evian. Bethan, we were just about to run out of time, but go ahead if you wanted to add something brief to that as kind of concluding remark.
Yes, I would say to Evian's point, the idea that we would go back to a sort of pre-Trumpian era, I think is not something that any of us would necessarily think is going to happen. What happens, or there's a theory called the Overton window, which is essentially a shift in acceptable narrative. Something that was fringe becomes acceptable over time as sort of our window of what is acceptable political rhetoric changes. And that in many ways has changed. And what it takes is individuals slowly pushing that window back to where it was before. And it's not going to be a matter of, okay, it's the 4th of November or it's the 20-something of January if this is, if the president changes. That really this will take much more time, and it won't necessarily go back to some base level of neutral or everyone is accepting everyone, but it will take time and effort on individuals' parts as well as institutions' parts to sort of redress this. But I think that we have to acknowledge that the mainstream is also changing, not just the fringe.
Thank you. That's a really excellent point to finish on, actually, and it underscores my concern that the Biden-Harris offer is let's just make everything, let's go back to the way things were. And what I hear a lot when I speak to people across the United States doing reporting is that they even those who voted for Obama are no longer interested in going back to that moment, that time. And if that's the offer, even though the polls suggest a significant lead, I'm concerned, because that was what Hillary Clinton was offering too, and it didn't go well for her. So that's just maybe a thought to end on. I would love most of all to thank our partners, the Center for the Analysis of the Radical Right, for this fantastic panel. And I encourage Julian to put a link to the content that we've produced together as part of our partnership in the Zoom chat, because it's really been a fantastic experience on our side, and there's lots of really fascinating, rich and well-informed contributions to many of the topics that we've covered today in that partnership with our friends at CAR. Thank you so much to everyone for participating. Next week, actually, interestingly, there's a fantastic panel which takes up some of the point about the Green New Deal and kind of left-wing populist movements that could be built around wanting to see action on climate change. So I'd encourage everyone to check that out. And if you're not already signed up to our newsletter, please do. It's opendemocracy.net/newsletter, and you can find out more about the discussion about all the content we've been publishing up towards the election there as well. And of course, I should say this because it's my job, but we don't rely on dark money. We're not sponsored by nefarious, anonymous plutocrats. So if you thought this was a worthwhile discussion to have, and if you think that independent media needs to be asking questions like this, please support us. You can do so at support.opendemocracy.net/donate. Thank you to all my fabulous panelists. You should all follow their excellent work and sign up for their podcasts and all those other fantastic things. And thank you all for joining us today. Goodbye. See you soon.